The camera fades from black to reveal weathered hands holding a crumpled rejection letter, trembling slightly in the dim light of a small apartment. "You're too old for this nonsense, Ethel." The words echo through time like a haunting melody, carrying the weight of crushed dreams and shattered confidence. But what happens when the world writes you off? When everyone around you believes your story has already ended? What happens when you're 75 years old and the people closest to you ridicule your deepest desires? Welcome back to our channel, where we dive deep into the extraordinary stories of ordinary people who refuse to let age define their limits. If you're new here and you believe that transformation has no expiration date, consider subscribing, because today's story will change how you view the power of the human spirit. This is the story of Ethel Mae Johnson, a woman who at 75 was mocked for daring to dream, only to silence every doubter by accomplishing what seemed impossible. Her journey wasn't just about learning languages. It was about finding her voice when the world had convinced her she had nothing left to say. The fluorescent lights in the community center buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Ethel Mae Johnson sat in the back row of the adult education meeting, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap. At 75, she had come to believe what everyone told her, that her time for new beginnings had passed long ago. The presenter at the front was discussing various courses available to seniors: cooking classes, gentle yoga, basic computer skills. But Ethel's attention wandered to the colorful posters on the walls advertising language courses: Spanish, French, Italian, German, Portuguese. Each poster seemed to whisper possibilities she had buried decades ago. As a young woman in rural Alabama, Ethel had dreamed of traveling the world, of speaking with people in their native tongues, of understanding the poetry that lived within foreign words. But life had other plans. Marriage at 19, to Harold Johnson, 3 children by 25, and a lifetime of putting everyone else's dreams before her own had slowly erased those youthful aspirations. Now, 56 years into marriage, Harold's health was failing, and their children, Robert, Margaret, and Patricia, lived their busy lives in distant cities. The small apartment they had downsized to after selling the family home felt more like a waiting room than a home. Each day blended into the next, marked only by doctor's appointments, grocery runs, and the steady tick of the grandfather clock that had somehow survived all their moves. But something stirred in Ethel that evening as she stared at those language posters. A tiny flame of the girl she used to be flickered to life, fragile as candlelight in a storm. When she arrived home, Harold was already in his recliner, oxygen tank humming beside him, watching his nightly news program. The apartment smelled of the beef stew she had prepared earlier, the same recipe she had been making for 30 years. "How was the meeting?" Harold asked without looking away from the television. Ethel hesitated at the threshold between the living room and kitchen, her coat still draped over her arm. The words she wanted to say felt foreign on her tongue, as if she were already attempting to speak in a language she didn't know. "They have language classes," she said quietly. Harold's attention remained fixed on the screen. "That's nice, dear. I was thinking..." Ethel's voice grew smaller. "Maybe I could try one. Spanish, perhaps, or French." This time Harold did turn, his expression shifting from indifference to bewilderment, then to something that looked uncomfortably like amusement. "Languages?" He chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Ethel, honey, you can barely work the remote control. What do you need languages for at your age?" The words hit her like physical blows. Ethel felt her face flush with embarrassment, though she couldn't quite articulate why. She had simply expressed an interest, a tiny spark of curiosity, and it had been immediately doused. "I just thought..." "Think practically," Harold interrupted, his tone growing sharper. "We've got medical bills to worry about, and you want to waste money on some fantasy? You're 75 years old, Ethel. This isn't the time for foolish notions." That night, as Ethel lay in bed listening to Harold's labored breathing, She stared at the ceiling and wondered when she had become so small. When had her dreams become foolish notions? When had her age become a prison sentence rather than evidence of a life fully lived? The ridicule didn't end with Harold. 2 weeks later, during their monthly family video call, Ethel made the mistake of mentioning her interest in learning languages to her children. The response was swift and unanimous. Robert, her eldest at 54, laughed outright. "Mom, you've never even been on an airplane. What are you going to do with Spanish?" Margaret, ever practical like her father, chimed in from her kitchen in Portland. "Mother, perhaps you should focus on staying healthy. At your age, stress isn't good for you. Learning a new language sounds incredibly stressful." Patricia, the youngest at 46, tried to soften the blow but delivered it nonetheless. "It's sweet that you're thinking of new hobbies, Mom, but maybe something more age-appropriate, like knitting or gardening." Each word of dismissal settled into Ethel's chest like stones. Her own children, the people she had sacrificed everything for, couldn't even entertain the possibility that she might have something left to give, some undiscovered part of herself worth nurturing. After the call ended, Harold shook his head with satisfaction. "See? Even the kids think it's ridiculous. Let's not hear any more about this language business." But the seed had been planted, and despite the hostile soil, it began to grow. Ethel found herself stopping by the community center on her weekly grocery trips, lingering near the bulletin board where the language class schedules were posted. She would touch the papers gently, as if they might disappear if she pressed too hard. The classes met 3 times a week in the evening. The cost was modest, $75 for an 8-week beginner's course. She had $75. It was part of the small emergency fund she had been secretly building from grocery money over the years, $1 here and there that Harold never noticed. She had told herself it was for a rainy day, though she had never dared to define what kind of rain she was preparing for. Standing there in the community center hallway, with the scent of industrial cleaning products and the distant sound of a yoga class in session, Ethel realized this might be her rainy day. But doubt plagued her. Harold's words echoed in her mind. "You're too old for this nonsense." Her children's laughter haunted her dreams. The voice of her late mother, who had spent her final years warning Ethel against putting on airs, seemed to whisper from beyond the grave. "Who do you think you are? What makes you think you're special enough to learn something new at your age?" The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in March, when Ethel was cleaning out an old chest of drawers that had belonged to her mother. Tucked between yellowed linens and faded photographs, she found her old high school diary, a small leather-bound book she hadn't seen in over 50 years. With trembling hands, she opened it to a random page and found an entry from her senior year. April 15th, 1965. Miss Rodriguez taught us French phrases today. La vie est belle. Life is beautiful. When she said it, it sounded like music. I want to learn French someday, maybe Italian too. I want to understand what people are really saying when they speak with passion. I want words to be music in my mouth. Ethel read the entry 3 times, tears blurring the carefully scripted words her 17-year-old self had penned with such hope. That girl had believed in possibilities. That girl had seen beauty in language, had hungered for connection and understanding. What had happened to her? She knew the answer, of course. Life had happened. Responsibilities, expectations, the slow erosion of dreams under the weight of daily survival. She had become exactly what the world expected of a woman of her generation. Selfless to the point of disappearing. But she wasn't gone. Not entirely. The woman who had written those words still lived somewhere inside her, buried under decades of being told she was too much or not enough, but never just right, as she was. That afternoon, while Harold napped and the apartment settled into its usual afternoon quiet, Ethel walked to the community center and signed up for beginning Spanish. Her hands shook as she wrote the check, and she nearly changed her mind 3 times on the walk home. But she had taken the first step into what felt like a new life. The Spanish classroom smelled like stale coffee and dry erase markers. 12 plastic chairs arranged in a semicircle faced a whiteboard where Bienvenidos was written in blue ink. Ethel arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a seat in the back row where she hoped to remain invisible. Her classmates trickled in, a mix of ages and backgrounds that surprised her. There was Maria, a young mother who wanted to communicate better with her Spanish-speaking in-laws. David, a recently retired engineer planning a trip to Costa Rica. Susan, a social worker who worked with immigrant families. And others, each carrying their own reasons for being there. When the instructor, Señora Valdez, entered the room, Ethel felt her heart race. The woman was perhaps 60 herself, with silver hair pulled into an elegant bun, and eyes that sparkled with genuine warmth. "Buenas noches, clase," Señora Valdez said, and even those simple words sounded musical to Ethel's ears. "Tonight we begin a journey together. Learning a language is not just about vocabulary and grammar. It's about opening your heart to a new way of seeing the world." The first lesson was basic. Introductions, numbers, simple greetings. When it came time for each student to introduce themselves in Spanish, Ethel's turn approached like an approaching storm. "Me llamo Ethel," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tengo 75 años. My name is Ethel. I am 75 years old." The words felt strange and wonderful in her mouth. No one laughed. No one shook their head in disapproval. Señora Valdez smiled and nodded with encouragement. "Muy bien, Ethel. Bienvenida." "Very good, Ethel." "Welcome." For the first time in months, Ethel felt welcome somewhere. Keeping her studies secret became an art form. On class nights, Ethel would tell Harold she was going to evening church services or visiting with a friend from the old neighborhood. He rarely asked for details, and she was grateful for his disinterest. The lies felt necessary. Each time she attempted to share her growing excitement about her progress, Harold's response ranged from eye-rolling to outright hostility. "You're becoming obsessed with this foolishness," he said one evening when he caught her practicing pronunciation in the kitchen. "It's not natural for a woman your age to be gallivanting around at night." So Ethel learned to study in silence. She would wake at 5 in the morning, an hour before Harold, and sit at the kitchen table with her Spanish workbook and a cup of coffee, absorbing vocabulary and practicing verb conjugations in whispered tones. She discovered that her mind, contrary to everyone's expectations, was hungry for knowledge. The Spanish words didn't feel foreign for long. They began to feel like old friends returning home. Her notebook filled with conjugations, cultural notes, and vocabulary lists written in her careful cursive. After 6 weeks of beginning Spanish, Ethel signed up for intermediate, then advanced. Señora Valdez became not just an instructor but a mentor, staying after class to practice conversations with Ethel, lending her Spanish novels and DVDs to watch at home. "You have a gift," Señora Valdez told her one evening after a particularly successful lesson, where Ethel had delivered a 2-minute monologue about her childhood entirely in Spanish. "Your pronunciation is excellent, and more than that, you understand the soul of the language." Ethel felt those words heal something in her she didn't even know was broken. But Spanish was just the beginning. By the end of her first year of Spanish, Ethel was dreaming in her new language. She would wake in the morning with Spanish phrases on her lips, her unconscious mind processing and organizing the day's lessons while she slept. Harold's health continued to decline, requiring more doctor's visits and medical care. Ethel found herself serving as translator when they encountered Spanish-speaking medical staff, and for the first time in decades, Harold seemed impressed by something she could do. "Where did you learn that?" he asked after she had helped communicate with a Puerto Rican nurse about his medication schedule. "I've been taking classes," Ethel said simply, no longer feeling the need to hide her accomplishment. Harold grunted but said nothing more. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't mockery either. It was acknowledgement. and that felt like progress. Emboldened by her success, Ethel signed up for French. If Spanish had felt like coming home, French felt like falling in love. The nasal sounds, the liquid pronunciation, the way emotions seemed to flow more freely in this language of poetry and passion. She devoured French films with subtitles, checked out French cookbooks from the library, and began to understand why her teenage self had been so captivated by La vie est belle. Life was beautiful, and she was finally learning to speak its many languages. Her instructor, Monsieur Dubois, was a retired professor from the local university who taught evening classes as a way to stay connected to his passion. He was demanding but encouraging, pushing his students to think in French rather than simply translating from English. "Madam Johnson," he said during one particularly challenging lesson on the subjunctive mood, "you approach this language like an artist approaches a canvas. You don't just want to speak French, you want to become French in your heart." It was true. Each new language wasn't just a skill to Ethel. It was a doorway into a different version of herself. In Spanish, she was more expressive, her hands moving as she spoke. In French, she felt more elegant, more philosophical, and she was just getting started. Italian came next, a natural progression from her Romance language foundation. Where Spanish felt like home and French like love, Italian felt like joy, explosive, dramatic, full of life and gesture and passion. Ethel found herself laughing more during Italian class, her inhibitions crumbling under the infectious enthusiasm of her instructor, Signora Romano, who insisted that speaking Italian without emotion was like singing opera in a whisper. "Bellissimo," Signora Romano would exclaim when Ethel mastered a particularly challenging pronunciation. "You have the soul of an Italiana." At home, Ethel began cooking Italian dishes she found in her language study materials, filling their small apartment with a sense of garlic and basil and fresh herbs. Harold, despite himself, began to look forward to these new culinary adventures. "This is different," he said one evening over a plate of homemade linguine alle vongole that Ethel had prepared from a recipe she'd found in an Italian conversation book. Good different. It was the closest thing to a compliment about her studies that he had ever offered. But even as Harold began to soften slightly toward her linguistic pursuits, the rest of the world remained skeptical. During a visit from Margaret, Ethel made the mistake of answering a phone call from Senora Valdez in fluent Spanish. "Mother, what was that?" Margaret demanded after Ethel hung up. "My Spanish instructor?" Ethel replied. She was asking about my progress in the advanced conversation class. Margaret's expression shifted from confusion to concern, to something that looked like embarrassment. "Mother, people are going to think you're eccentric. Elderly women who suddenly start speaking foreign languages. It's not normal." The word normal hit Ethel like a slap. She had spent 75 years being normal, being what everyone expected, fitting into the small space the world had carved out for her. Normal had nearly killed the part of her that mattered most. "Maybe normal is overrated," Ethel said quietly, and Margaret had no response to that. 3 years into her linguistic journey, Ethel had achieved conversational fluency in Spanish, French, and Italian. She was beginning her second year of German, a language that challenged her in entirely new ways with its complex grammar and precise structure. Unlike the flowing Romance languages, German demanded precision, logic, a different kind of mental discipline that Ethel found oddly satisfying. Her German instructor, Herr Wagner, was a retired businessman who had spent decades working in international trade. He appreciated Ethel's methodical approach to the language's complexities. "You have the patience for German," he told her one evening after class. "Many students get frustrated with our cases and word order. You embrace the challenge." It was during a German lesson about travel vocabulary that Herr Wagner mentioned something that would change everything. "There is a cultural exchange program," he said casually, while discussing airport terminology. "The International Senior Language Institute. They offer immersion programs for adults over 60, a month in Germany, practicing conversation with native speakers, experiencing the culture firsthand. Ethel felt her heart skip a beat. Travel, immersion, the possibility of using her languages in their natural habitat. How much does something like that cost? Asked David, one of her fellow students. It varies, Herr Wagner replied. But there are scholarships available, especially for exceptional students. That word, exceptional, followed Ethel home that evening and whispered to her through the night. The International Senior Language Institute scholarship application sat on Ethel's kitchen table for 2 weeks before she found the courage to open it. The requirements were intimidating. Essays in each language she had studied, letters of recommendation from instructors, a personal statement explaining her motivation for language learning. But it was the final requirement that stopped her cold. A 5-minute video submission demonstrating conversational ability in at least 3 languages. A video where people could see her, judge her, potentially mock her. Ethel had never made a video of herself in her life. The technology felt overwhelming, the vulnerability terrifying. She was 78 years old now, with silver hair and lined hands and a voice that sometimes wavered with uncertainty. What if she looked foolish? What if her pronunciation wasn't as good as she thought? The application deadline was approaching when Señora Valdez asked her to stay after Spanish class. I heard about the scholarship program, she said gently. Herr Wagner mentioned you might be interested. Ethel nodded, unable to trust her voice. I've been teaching for 30 years, Señora Valdez continued. I have never had a student with your combination of dedication, natural ability, and genuine love for language learning. You should apply. I'm scared, Ethel admitted. What if I'm not good enough? What if they take one look at me and wonder what an old woman thinks she's doing? Señora Valdez smiled. Do you know what I see when I look at you, Ethel? I see someone who refused to let the world make her smaller. I see someone who discovered that age is not an ending, but a beginning. That is exactly what they need to see. That evening, with Harold asleep in his chair and the apartment quiet around her, Ethel set up her laptop computer, a skill she had taught herself along with her languages, and began recording. 5 languages, 5 minutes. A lifetime of dreams distilled into a digital file. Ethel began in English, introducing herself and explaining her journey. Then Spanish, talking about her love for the culture and literature she had discovered. French, reciting a poem by Pablo Neruda that she had memorized. Italian, describing a recipe for ossobuco with the enthusiasm Signora Romano had taught her. German, discussing the philosophy of language learning with the precision Herr Wagner had instilled. She recorded the video 17 times before she was satisfied. Not perfect. There were still small stumbles, moments where her age showed in the slight tremor of her voice or the careful way she pronounced certain sounds. But it was authentic. It was her. The personal statement took longer. How could she explain what these languages had meant to her? How could she convey the transformation from a woman who believed her story was over to one who realized it was just beginning a new chapter? She wrote about the girl who had dreamed of speaking music with her mouth. She wrote about the decades of silence that had followed. She wrote about the moment she found her voice again, not in her native tongue, but in the borrowed words of other cultures that had somehow become her own. Language learning at my age is not about practical communication, she wrote. It is about proving that curiosity has no expiration date, that growth is not reserved for the young, and that the human capacity for wonder is infinite. Every new word is a small rebellion against a world that wants to write us off. Every conversation in a foreign tongue is proof that we are more than what others expect us to be. She submitted the application on a Tuesday morning in October, then spent the rest of the day trying not to think about it. The phone rang on a Thursday afternoon in December, while Ethel was preparing Harold's lunch. She almost didn't answer. They got so many medical appointment reminders and sales calls that she had developed the habit of letting unfamiliar numbers go to voicemail. But something made her pick up. Mrs. Johnson? This is Dr. Andreas Müller from the International Senior Language Institute in Berlin. Ethel's knees went weak. She sat down heavily in the nearest chair. I'm calling with good news, Dr. Müller continued in accented but perfect English. Your application has been selected for our full scholarship program. We would like to offer you a spot in our March immersion program in Germany. The words seemed to come from very far away. Scholarship, Germany, March. Mrs. Johnson, are you there? Yes, Ethel whispered. Yes, I'm here. Your video submission was extraordinary, Dr. Müller said. But more than your language skills, your essay moved our selection committee deeply. You represent exactly the kind of student our program was designed to serve. Someone who refuses to accept limitations, who sees learning as a lifelong journey. After she hung up, Ethel sat in her kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone and wondering if she had imagined the entire conversation. Germany, a month in Germany, speaking German with native speakers, living with a host family, attending lectures at the university. At 78 years old, she was finally going to see the world. Breaking the news to Harold required careful timing and strategy. Ethel waited until he had finished his dinner and was settled in his favorite chair with the television turned to his preferred news program. Harold, she began, her voice steadier than she felt. I need to tell you something. He glanced at her with mild interest. I've been accepted into a program in Germany, a language immersion program. The silence that followed felt endless. Harold's expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally anger. Germany, his voice rose. You want to go to Germany? Ethel, you've lost your mind completely. It's only for a month, she said quickly. Everything is paid for. It's a scholarship. I don't care if it's free. Harold's face was reddening. You're 78 years old. You've never been on a plane. You don't know anyone there. What if something happens to me while you're gone? This was the argument Ethel had been dreading. Harold's health was indeed fragile, though not critically so according to his doctors. But he had spent years using his condition as a way to keep her close, to limit her world to the size of their small apartment. Margaret will come stay with you, Ethel said. She already said she could take time off work. You talked to Margaret about this before talking to me? The hurt in his voice was real, and Ethel felt a stab of guilt. But underneath the guilt was something stronger, a determination she hadn't felt in decades. Harold, she said gently, I've spent 56 years putting your needs before mine. I've been a good wife, a devoted mother. I've earned this. Earned what? The right to abandon your family for some ridiculous fantasy? The right to discover who I am beyond this apartment, beyond taking care of everyone else. The right to use the gifts I've discovered in myself. They argued for an hour. Harold used every weapon in his emotional arsenal. Guilt, fear, accusations of selfishness. But for the first time in their marriage, Ethel didn't back down. She was going to Germany. The 3 months between the acceptance call and departure flew by in a whirlwind of preparation. Ethel applied for her first passport, a process that felt both bureaucratic and magical. The small blue book with her photograph seemed like a key to doors she had never imagined opening. Her German studies intensified. Herr Wagner arranged private tutoring sessions to prepare her for full immersion. They practiced ordering food in restaurants, asking for directions, discussing current events, all the conversations she would need to navigate independently in a foreign country. You are ready, he assured her during their final session. Your German is excellent, your confidence is growing, and your attitude is perfect. You will not just survive this experience, you will thrive. Margaret arrived 2 weeks before Ethel's departure, still expressing doubts about the entire enterprise. Mother, I just don't understand why this is so important to you, she said while helping Ethel pack. You have a good life here. Why risk everything for some program in a country where you don't know anyone? Ethel paused in folding a sweater, considering how to explain something she was still understanding herself. When I was your age, she said finally, I thought my life was over. Oh, I had decades left, but I thought the interesting parts, the growing parts, were finished. I was wrong. These past few years, learning languages, discovering I could still learn new things, still surprise myself. It's made me feel alive again. Margaret's expression softened slightly. But Germany, Mom, it's so far away. That's exactly the point, Ethel replied. O'Hare International Airport was overwhelming. A chaos of languages, announcements, hurrying people with rolling suitcases and urgent destinations. Ethel stood in the departure terminal with her single piece of luggage, watching travelers who seemed to navigate this complexity with casual expertise. Harold had insisted on coming to see her off, though his goodbye had been stiff and perfunctory. Call when you land, he had said, and try not to do anything foolish. Margaret hugged her more warmly, but with worry evident in her eyes. Standing alone in the gate area, waiting for her first international flight, Ethel felt a moment of pure panic. What was she doing? She was nearly 80 years old, about to fly to a foreign country where she knew no one, planning to live with strangers and navigate a culture she had only experienced through textbooks and videos. The boarding announcement came in English and German. Lufthansa Flight 431 to Frankfurt, now boarding all passengers. Ethel joined the line of travelers, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and anticipation. When she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, the young woman smiled and said, Guten Flug, have a good flight. Dankeschön, Ethel replied automatically, and the woman's smile brightened with surprise and approval. As the plane lifted off from Chicago, Ethel pressed her face to the small window and watched the city shrink below her. She was flying. At 78 years old, she was finally flying toward a dream she had almost forgotten she was allowed to have. Frankfurt Airport was a marvel of efficient German engineering, but it was also completely foreign and intimidating. Ethel followed the signs marked International Arrivals and hoped she was heading in the right direction. At customs, the officer looked at her passport with curiosity. First time in Germany? He asked in English. Yes, Ethel replied, then added in careful German, Ich bin sehr aufgeregt, hier zu sein. I am very excited to be here. His stern expression cracked into a smile. Ihr Deutsch ist sehr gut. Welcome to Germany. Dr. Miller was waiting in the arrivals area, holding a sign with her name. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Mrs. Johnson, welcome to Germany. He greeted her in English, then switched to German. Wie war Ihr Flug? How was your flight? Lang aber aufregend, Ethel replied. Long, but exciting. During the train ride from Frankfurt to the smaller university town where the program was based, Ethel watched the German countryside roll past. Neat fields, orderly towns, church spires pointing toward gray March skies. Everything looked exactly like the photographs in her textbooks, but somehow more real, more vivid. You will be staying with the Richter family, Doctor. Muller explained in German, speaking slowly and clearly. Frau Richter is retired professor of literature. Her husband was the engineer. They have been hosting our students for 10 years. The Richter house was a 3-story building with a red tile roof and flower boxes that would bloom with color in the coming spring. Frau Richter, a woman perhaps Ethel's age with silver hair pulled into an efficient bun, greeted them at the door. Willkommen, she said warmly, embracing Ethel like an old friend. Wir freuen uns, Sie bei uns zu haben. We are happy to have you with us. That evening, over dinner with the Richter family, including their adult son Klaus, who lived nearby, Ethel found herself participating in her first completely German conversation outside a classroom. They talked about her journey, her reasons for learning German, her impressions of their country. Sie sprechen sehr gut für jemanden, der erst vor ein paar Jahren angefangen hat, Klaus said. You speak very well for someone who only started a few years ago. Es ist nie zu spät zu lernen, Ethel replied. It's never too late to learn. Genau! Frau Richter exclaimed. Exactly! As Ethel settled into her small but comfortable room that night, she realized something profound had happened. For the first time in decades, she had spent an entire day being not Harold's wife, not Margaret's mother, not the elderly woman everyone expected her to be. She had simply been Ethel, a student, a traveler, someone worthy of interest and conversation. She was becoming herself again, one German word at a time. The days in Germany developed a rhythm that felt both structured and liberating. Morning German classes at the university, where Ethel studied alongside other international students, some decades younger than her, but all united in the common struggle of mastering a complex language. Afternoon cultural excursions to museums, historical sites, local markets, evenings with the Richter family, practicing conversational German over dinner, and sharing stories about their very different lives. Ethel discovered that her age, rather than being a liability, was often an asset. Her fellow students treated her with a mixture of respect and amazement. The Germans she met seemed delighted by an American grandmother who had chosen to learn their language and explore their culture. Sie haben Mut. You have courage. An elderly German man told her one afternoon in a coffee shop, where she was practicing reading a German newspaper. Viele Menschen in ihrem Alter haben Angst vor neuen Erfahrungen. Many people your age are afraid of new experiences. Angst ist nur ein Gefühl, Ethel replied. Fear is only a feeling. Es muss uns nicht kontrollieren. It doesn't have to control us. The conversation continued for an hour, covering topics from German reunification to American politics to the universal experience of aging. When Ethel finally returned to the Richter house, she felt as though she had passed some invisible test, not just of language proficiency, but of belonging. 2 weeks into her stay, during a group excursion to a medieval castle, something shifted in Ethel's understanding of herself. The tour guide was explaining the history of the fortress in rapid German, and Ethel realized she was understanding not just the words, but the subtleties, the humor, the cultural references embedded in the presentation. She wasn't just speaking German, she was thinking in German. That evening, she called Harold from the Richter house. The international connection was scratchy, but his voice came through clearly enough. "How are you managing over there?" he asked, and for the first time, there was genuine curiosity rather than disapproval in his tone. "I'm not managing," Ethel said. "I'm thriving." She told him about her classes, her conversations, the kindness of the German people she had met. She described the castles and museums, the efficient trains, the different approach to daily life she was observing. "You sound different," Harold said after she had finished. "Your voice sounds stronger." "I feel stronger," Ethel replied. "I feel like myself again." There was a long pause before Harold spoke again. "Maybe I was wrong to try to talk you out of this." It was the closest to an apology she had ever received from him, and it felt like a gift. The program culminated in a final presentation. Each student was required to give a 20-minute talk in German on a topic of their choosing. Ethel chose to speak about lebenslanges Lernen, lifelong learning. Standing before an audience of fellow students, instructors, and German host families, Ethel began to speak in German about her journey from a woman who believed her story was over to one who discovered it was just beginning a new chapter. She talked about the ridicule she had faced, the doubt she had overcome, the joy of discovering that her mind was still capable of growth and change. She spoke about the connections between language and identity, how each new tongue had revealed a different facet of who she could become. "Ich habe gelernt, dass Alter nicht das Ende der Geschichte ist," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I have learned that age is not the end of the story. Es ist nur ein neues Kapitel. Und jede neue Sprache ist eine neue Seite in diesem Kapitel. It is only a new chapter, and each new language is a new page in that chapter." The applause that followed was thunderous. Several people in the audience were wiping their eyes. Dr. Mueller approached the podium with tears in his own eyes. "In 20 years of running this program," he said in German, "I have never heard a presentation that so perfectly captured why we do this work. Frau Johnson, you are an inspiration to us all." The flight back to Chicago felt different from the journey to Germany. Ethel was returning not as the same woman who had left, but as someone transformed. She carried with her not just souvenirs and photographs, but a new understanding of her own capabilities. Harold was waiting at the airport, and his greeting was warmer than his goodbye had been. During the drive home, he listened as she shared stories from her month abroad, and she could see something had shifted in how he viewed her. "I was proud of you," he said quietly as they pulled into their apartment complex. "When people asked where my wife was, I told them she was in Germany, studying at a university. I was proud." That evening, unpacking her suitcase in their small bedroom, Ethel found a letter from Frau Richter that had been tucked into her belongings as a surprise. Written in careful English, it read, "Dear Ethel, having you in our home was a gift. You reminded us that curiosity and courage have no age limit. You showed our son that learning is not just for the young. You will always have a place at our table. With love and admiration. Helga Richter." Germany had been a revelation, but it was also just the beginning. Ethel returned home with Portuguese textbooks and dreams of Brazil. If she could navigate the cultural complexities of Germany at 78, why not explore the rhythmic beauty of Portuguese at 79? Harold, perhaps chastened by her success, or simply worn down by his inability to contain her newfound confidence, offered only token resistance. "Another language?" he asked wearily when she showed him the course catalog. "The last one," Ethel promised, though they both knew she might be lying. Portuguese proved to be her greatest challenge yet. The nasal sounds were difficult for her aging vocal cords, and the grammar seemed to shift like sand beneath her feet. But Ethel had learned something valuable in Germany. Struggle was not failure, it was growth. Her Portuguese instructor, Professor Santos, was a young woman from São Paulo who had never taught a student over 40, let alone nearing 80. Initially skeptical of Ethel's ability to master such a complex language, she quickly became one of her greatest advocates. "Você tem uma determinação que eu nunca vi," she told Ethel after a particularly difficult lesson on subjunctive mood. "You have a determination I have never seen. Você me ensina que idade é apenas número. You teach me that age is just a number." 5 years after that first Spanish class, 4 languages after that moment of ridicule in their living room, Ethel May Johnson stood before a gathering that would have seemed impossible to her younger self. The International Conference on Adult Language Learning had invited her to speak as their keynote presenter. The audience included linguistics professors, education policymakers, and adult education advocates from around the world. At 80 years old, Ethel had become something she never expected. An expert. The conference was being held at a prestigious university in her home state, less than 3 hours from her small apartment. Harold, now using a wheelchair but insisting on attending, sat in the front row beside Margaret, Robert, and Patricia. Her children, who had once mocked her foolish notions, now looked at her with something approaching awe. Ethel approached the podium with confidence earned through years of classroom presentations, conversations with strangers, and the deep knowledge that she belonged wherever her curiosity led her. She would speak in English today, but she could have delivered the same presentation in Spanish, French, Italian, German, or Portuguese. "My name is Ethel May Johnson," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. 5 years ago, at the age of 75, I was ridiculed for expressing interest in learning a foreign language. Today, I stand before you fluent in 5 languages, having traveled to 3 countries as a cultural ambassador and serving on the advisory board of 2 international educational organizations. She paused, letting that transformation sink in. I am not here to tell you that age is irrelevant. It is not. Learning at 75 is different from learning at 25. But I am here to tell you that different does not mean inferior. It does not mean impossible. It simply means we must be willing to redefine what we think we know about human potential. She spoke for 45 minutes about the neuroscience of language learning in older adults, about the social barriers that discourage elderly education, about the profound psychological benefits of intellectual challenge in later life. But mostly, she spoke about the importance of refusing to accept other people's limitations as your own truth. Every language I learned gave me a new way to see the world, she concluded. But more than that, each one gave me a new way to see myself, not as a woman whose story was ending, but as one whose most interesting chapters were just beginning. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. When it finally quieted, a young woman in the audience raised her hand. Mrs. Johnson, what would you say to someone who feels too old to start something new? Ethel smiled, thinking of that evening 78 years ago when she first saw those colorful language posters and felt a spark of the girl she used to be. I would say that too old is not a fact. It's an opinion, and opinions can be changed. Dreams don't have expiration dates. Curiosity doesn't retire. The question is not whether you're too old to start. The question is whether you're too afraid to try. After the conference, local media picked up Ethel's story. The interview requests began small: a feature in the community newspaper, a segment on the morning show of a regional television station. But the story had legs, as journalists say. Soon, national news outlets were calling. Grandmother learns 5 languages after 75 became an internet sensation. The video of her conference presentation went viral, viewed by millions around the world. Messages poured in from people of all ages who had been inspired by her example. A retirement community in Florida invited her to speak to their residents. A community college in Oregon asked her to develop a curriculum for senior language learners. A documentary filmmaker wanted to follow her to Brazil, where she was planning her next immersion experience. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Harold, weakened by years of illness, but strengthened by watching his wife bloom into someone he barely recognized as the quiet woman he had married, asked to speak with her one evening after dinner. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice raspy but determined. "All these years, I tried to make you smaller because I was afraid of you becoming bigger than me. I was wrong. Watching you these past few years, seeing what you've accomplished, I'm proud to be married to you. I'm proud to tell people about my wife, the linguist." Ethel took his hand, feeling the weight of decades of misunderstanding finally lifting. "We both became who we needed to become," she said gently. "It just took us a long time to get there." On a warm evening in May, 5 years after her first Spanish class and just weeks before her 81st birthday, Ethel returned to the community center where it all began. The same fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the same plastic chairs were arranged in their semicircle, and the same colorful language posters decorated the walls. But this time, she wasn't a student in the back row, hoping to remain invisible. She was the instructor, preparing to teach her first class in language learning for active seniors. 12 students had enrolled, ages ranging from 62 to 77. They sat nervously, clutching new notebooks and pens, many of them probably wondering if they were too old for such an undertaking. Ethel looked at them and saw herself from years ago, uncertain, hopeful, afraid of being ridiculed, but willing to risk it anyway. "Welcome to beginning Spanish," she said, writing "Bienvenidos" on the whiteboard just as Señora Valdez had done years before. "Tonight we begin a journey together. Learning a language is not just about vocabulary and grammar. It's about opening your heart to a new way of seeing the world." One student, a woman about Ethel's age, raised her hand tentatively. "Mrs. Johnson, I have to ask, is it really possible to learn a new language at our age? I mean, really learn it?" Ethel smiled, remembering asking Senora Valdez the same question years ago. "Let me tell you a story," she said, settling into her role as teacher and mentor. 5 years ago, I was ridiculed for even asking that question. Today, I can tell you that story in 5 different languages. She switched to fluent Spanish. Pero más importante que los idiomas que aprendí fue lo que descubrí sobre mí misma. But more important than the languages I learned was what I discovered about myself. Then to French. J'ai appris que nos rêves n'ont pas de date d'expiration. I learned that our dreams have no expiration date. Italian. Ho scoperto che la curiosità non va in pensione. I discovered that curiosity doesn't retire. German. Ich erfuhr, dass Mut kein Alter kennt. I found out that courage knows no age. And finally, Portuguese. E aprendi que nunca é tarde demais para se tornar quem você realmente é. And I learned that it's never too late to become who you really are. The classroom fell silent. Several students were wiping their eyes. So to answer your question, Ethel continued in English. Yes, it is absolutely possible to learn a new language at our age. But more than that, it's possible to discover that age is not an ending. It's just another beginning waiting for us to be brave enough to start. She picked up a piece of chalk and wrote her first lesson on the board. Me llamo. My name is. Let's begin with introductions, she said. In Spanish, we say me llamo, followed by your name. But I want you to think of this as more than just stating your name. Think of it as introducing the person you're about to become. As her students stumbled through their first Spanish words, Ethel felt the profound satisfaction of a circle completed. She had gone from being the ridiculed dreamer to the woman proving that those dreams were not just possible, but powerful. At 75, they had laughed at her ambitions. At 80, she was teaching others to reach for their own. 2 years later, Ethel May Johnson published her memoir, 5 Languages, 1 Life, A Journey of Discovery After 75. It became a bestseller in the self-help and memoir categories, translated into 12 languages, and read by millions worldwide. She established a foundation providing scholarships for seniors wanting to pursue language learning or travel abroad. Her TED Talk, The Neuroscience of Never Too Late, became one of the most watched presentations in the platform's history. Harold passed away peacefully in his sleep 6 months after Ethel's 82nd birthday. At his funeral, she delivered his eulogy in English, but ended with a prayer in Spanish, a language that had given her the words to express gratitude for a complicated marriage that had ultimately taught them both how to grow. At 85, Ethel still teaches her weekly Spanish class at the community center. She's working on her 6th language, Mandarin Chinese, and planning a trip to Beijing with a group of students from her foundation. When interviewers ask her about her plans for the future, she always gives the same answer, usually in whichever language feels most appropriate for the moment. My story isn't over yet. Every day I wake up, I'm still becoming who I'm meant to be. Age gave me patience, experience gave me wisdom, but curiosity keeps me young. Last month, a letter arrived from a woman in Tokyo who had seen Ethel's story online. Written in careful English, it said, "Dear Mrs. Johnson, I am 73 years old and always wanted to learn English. My family says I'm too old, but after watching your video, I signed up for classes. Today I wrote my first letter in English. It is to you. Thank you for showing me that dreams don't die just because we get older. They just wait for us to be brave enough to pick them up again." Ethel keeps that letter on her desk, next to photos from Germany, Brazil, and Italy, next to certificates of completion from 5 different language programs, next to the worn leather diary from her teenage years, open to the page where she first wrote about wanting words to be music in her mouth. At 85, Ethel May Johnson has learned that life's most beautiful music often comes in languages we never expected to speak, at ages we never expected to reach, from dreams we never expected to survive. She was ridiculed at 75 for daring to hope she could learn something new. Now she's proof that the only thing more powerful than mockery is the quiet determination of a human being who refuses to accept that their story is over. Nunca es demasiado tarde? Il n'est jamais trop tard? Non è mai troppo tardi. Istes ni suspet. Nunca è tarde demais. Never too late. In any language. At any age. Thank you for watching this incredible journey with us. Ethel Mae Johnson's story reminds us that transformation doesn't have an expiration date, and that the bravest thing we can do is refuse to let others define what's possible for our lives. What dream are you ready to pick up again? Let us know in the comments below.